start. So, hello everyone. My name is Desa Karye Daniel, and welcome back to the Division 45 Virtual Mentorship Program. I'm very excited today to have Chye Hong and Alia talking to us about spirituality and self-care. And so I will let you jump into introductions. So tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are and what you're doing.
Sure. So my name is Alia. I'm a fourth year in a counseling psychology doctoral program at Purdue University. So right now I live in West Lafayette, Indiana. I study Muslim women and their experiences. And then I'm just about to start my dissertation, and my dissertation will look at Muslim women's experiences in therapy, and just the variety of things that come up and how race and gender and their religious/spiritual identification impacts experiences in therapy.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, I am Chye Hong, and I am a fifth-year doctoral student in counseling psychology at Purdue University. So it's the same program as Alia. I am an international student from Malaysia, and this is probably my 7th year in the US. I did my undergrad in University of Illinois, and then now to West Lafayette in Indiana. So they're both 2 hours apart. So the US that I've known really has been mostly Midwest, like global Midwest US. So what I study is grief and loss issues. So I'm particularly interested in how college students experience grief. How do they communicate about grief with their family members? Why do they avoid? Why do they talk about it? And how that's related to their well-being.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here today and being a part of this opportunity and talking with us. And so I really wanted to jump in first with a little bit of questions kind of about who you are and what y'all are doing. So thank you about your research interests. But I was also wondering, what are some reasons you entered into your field of study?
So I entered into counseling psychology really because I have really enjoyed or am curious about how people interact with each other, and that really is very broadly starting from high school, and then just seeing how some of the students are adjusting well to high school, and then some students, my friends, are not adjusting so well, and then why that's the case, and then really moving from there, and a lot of times realizing that I have a lot of stories that I hear around me, and then realizing how much of the stories are not heard by people that they really want them to hear. And then that really sparked my interest in counseling psychology, where I see myself being in a position where I can hear a lot of stories, hold space for those stories to be heard, and unintended consequences of which is that my own story, life story, is changed a lot of times by the stories that I hear and experience along the way.
Yeah. All right, Alia?
Yeah, so I sometimes still wonder how I ended up in counseling psych sometimes. I studied global health in college, so that was sort of like a nice intersection between public health and anthropology. So I've always really been interested in culture and systems and different sort of conceptualizations of health. And then I went to therapy in college, and I identify as a Muslim woman, and I had some really good experiences, and then I had some not so great experiences, and I found that when I talked about those experiences, I wasn't alone in the spectrum sort of good, bad, and everything in between, and the ways in which microaggressions show up in the therapy space, and the ways in which parts of your identities are erased unintentionally in the therapy space. So I thought that it was important that I investigated that more, and I applied to a PhD program, and I'm really, really grateful to be here and to be able to work through all of the systems that sort of train the people that end up seeing people who look like me or identify in a similar way. And so I'm really just excited to be in a space that I can see and impact some of how training works in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting because you guys both talked about listening to stories, but also how your stories were impacted. So either like in having a good or a difficult counseling experience, but then really being like, wow, like these are the stories that are changing my own perspective. And that's how I'm interacting with others. And like we're also creating like almost shared stories or shared memories, but then moving towards this greater idea of like ultimately making the world a little bit better for like identities who aren't always like at the forefront. So like you said something unintentionally like having your identity erased, and I think that's something that happens a lot, especially in therapy and in our profession as a whole, that people really unintentionally do, but it can be really impactful. So I'm wondering now, like as you kind of like, okay, like I'm a counseling psychologist, I'm in this PhD program, when did you realize that spirituality and self-care was like really important for your overall career goals?
So I have just never not known that spirituality was a big part of my life goal or like my life path. I think being a Pakistani Muslim American woman is like the most salient part of me, and I have been engaging in deeper ways around like what that means with other sort of racial identities and other marginalized identities. But at the end of the day, I think I consider myself a very spiritual person, and I used to consider myself a very religious person. And I guess I just don't know a life where that isn't important to me. I think just as time has gone on, it's gotten more nuanced, it's gotten more complex. And I've had to become more comfortable acknowledging that spirituality is a form of self-care for me. Whereas before, I think earlier on in my graduate training, I didn't feel like there was space for that. And now I think that I'm making space for myself to own this part of me, and to also not feel like I have to hide this part of me. Because a lot of people have complex relationships with religion and very complex relationships with spiritual discussions. So yeah.
And I think for me too, it's also somewhat similar, similar and different in different sense. Similar in that in the beginning of my training in my graduate program, I didn't necessarily see religion or spirituality as a big part of that work. And it's interesting because I do grief and loss research work, and almost all the time when we talk about grief and loss, almost the first thing, or at least I'm assuming here that religion or spirituality would be one of the first things that come up for people, right? And along this process, I'm also trying to make sense of why that is not the case for me. I identify as a Buddhist, and that has changed along my entire life. Initially, when I was growing up in Malaysia, it's a multicultural, it's a multi-religious society, and religion is very much woven and emphasized in a lot of the different parts of my life. And yet, in my family, we would have deities, and then we've got altar at home that we would offer food, offer fruits, and then being a part of that ritual and the process with my family. And so in the part of the process when I was growing up, it's really more so the rituals and then being with family, not so much about, and there's a level of that protection, right? Of hoping to get a protection from the higher power. But there's not so much in terms of how it's impacting my philosophy in life. And then when I went to college, I joined a group. It's a Taiwanese-based Buddhist group. It's called Chye Buddhist Foundation, and that it is, in Mandarin, it means compassion and relief. So it's a Buddhist organization that brings a lot of the Buddhism philosophy into action, and then doing a lot of the social justice work around different parts of the world. And that's when I started to get more into an understanding about Buddhism philosophy as a philosophy of life, not just protection. And then in looking back, and that was I think there was an exposure period throughout undergrad, even in the first few years of my graduate program of, oh, so this is the philosophy of life that I seem to resonate with. And then seeing, for instance, suffering to me is an inevitable part of life. And that's one of the basic tenets of Buddhism. And then more and more realizing that that is the way that I see the world, that it is the lens that I use to work with my clients. And that being gentle, being compassionate in observing and not being attached emotionally and attached in many different ways to this suffering can in a way bring relief from the suffering, a different perspective to experience. So there was a moment when I'm realizing, oh, I actually incorporate this lens more than I think I am doing. And then having conversations with myself, what does that mean to you then when you actually don't want to identify as a religious person, you want to identify, or I want to identify as a spiritual person. And then along the way realizing that, oh, more and more I'm incorporating this into a part of myself, my clinical work, not so much my research work just yet. We'll see what that meant. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like you both really talked about religion versus spirituality, and I thought that was an interesting thing because it's Alia, you said it's not just like the nuances, but also how things become more complex. But then Chye Hong, you really brought it together and talked about like the philosophy of life, and I thought it really made me think about how we evolve in our field and in our profession as scholars, and kind of like how our identity is like maybe one thing our first year, but then over time our identity really changes, and really how it's like this awareness of like, oh, I'm doing this a lot more than I realized. I just don't think I put a label on it yet. And I'm wondering like, and you kind of talked about it a little bit already, Chye Hong, but like when you're starting to realize like, oh, this is innately a part of my identity, do you think that awareness changed anything? Or maybe like, do you feel like your intentionality changed in any way?
Mm-hmm. It definitely did change for me in that sense. I think it started more from my personal life because so when I was doing and being involved in an organization, it's more on a personal time. And so things like, I remember, and then the first time that I realized the two worlds collide in terms of my personal life and my professional life collide is when I brought in a quote into, so there are like little cards like this that is very much sayings from the religious leader, and then it is a quote of life. It is a quote that I a lot of times just refer to when I'm really having difficult times in my life. And then I just brought in as an activity, as a centering activity in group supervision class, and then just having people randomly draw one that they are attracted to, and then having one of my program mates who was really having a lot of difficult times at the time draw one that says stopping halfway is more difficult and tiring than persevering on the path toward that final goal. And that was a moment of shock for both of us because we both are aware of the story that was going on for her, and then realizing that and then it was that time where I realized this part of my life that gives me some affirmation at times can be brought into my clinical or professional life. And then and along the way to realizing when I make the connection that it shows up more in my professional life than I intended it to be. I think giving that voice and recognizing that religion and spirituality maybe is more important than I and giving it credit to. And that was also the moment that I realized too how I have not talked about spirituality with my clients, how I've not talked about religion with my client, and how in a way just kind of connecting to what we talked about earlier of erasing that part of identity for clients, especially when they're in counseling room, and that's something that's important to them and at the time not important for me, and how I'm erasing that.
Absolutely. How about you, Alia? Do you feel like that awareness changed your intentionality or how you practiced in your client work once you really started incorporating spirituality into your identity in a different way?
Yeah, I'm struggling, I think, with my client work. I don't see, Chye Hong and I actually talked about this earlier, about how we read your questions in different ways, where
Mhm.
I had sort of interpreted the question around work and I went straight to research, and she was talking more about work in terms of clinical work. And so,
Mhm.
um, could you repeat the question? So, like, how has it changed my intentionality?
Yeah, and it really could be research as well. I think that so as a counselor educator, I think we talk a lot about separating our identities in terms of like client work, like scholarly research, things like that. But when I heard you both talking, it really sounded like over time your identities have kind of like molded together and like really feeling like you're a whole person all the time, and spirituality is a part of that. So maybe not clinical work for you, but like even in research, how has that, the awareness that it's an important part of your identity, changed your intentionality and the work you're doing overall?
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. And I think I'm going to answer similar to what I said earlier, where like my research work has always focused on Muslim American women. I think the more I learn about myself and my positionality in the Muslim community or the Muslim American community, the deeper and the richer I've been able to confront some of my own biases and how that is showing up in my work. So it's less about that the intentionality is changed in terms of the Muslim identity piece, but more around, you know, again, like if I identify as Pakistani American Muslim woman, how is that showing up in my work? So like, you know, what are the class implications of that? Who am I recruiting from? Because I do have class, like some types of education privilege, at least that I'm doing my PhD. And so like, what does that mean for the people that are missing from my sample? I you know, the South Asian community, sometimes the Muslim community sometimes is not as connected to the Black Muslim community, or different like immigrant or refugee communities from different areas. And so what are the implications of that? And like when I write about Muslim women, who am I really writing about? And who am I then unintentionally erasing in terms of the experience, and what can I do to uplift other experiences of Muslim American women, and ensuring that those complexities are showing up in my work. And if they're not showing up in my work, being very intentional about writing about why, and naming that, and naming how closely aligned my personal and professional work is, so that people don't get it twisted that like this is how all Muslim American women are.
Yeah, I think that's really difficult because I think given what's happening in the White House and in the United States political structure as a whole, like even probably before 9/11, but even since, there's been a lot of discourse in this idea of like what that picture looks like. And so even when you're using words that should be so open and like inclusive, they end up um, not including everyone depending on like who's receiving that information, right? So like even I think how difficult it could be to create a space for us to really connect to everyone who could be involved through identity and through intentionality, but realizing that people still may feel left out unless you're like implicitly like saying like this is for each and every one of us, and like naming them individually. So I think about all the social media campaigns that are like say her name, like making sure that women are represented in all light, even though often we think directly to men, or we're not always like holding the space because like I'm African American, but like that explains like a lot of people and not everyone looks like me, right? So how do we be intentional in that? And I really like what you both said about making sure you're creating spaces for people to tell their own stories, but then also making sure that it's like good for yourself as well. So like at the end of the day, making sure you feel like you did what you needed to do and you tried your best not to leave anyone out. Or if you know you're doing it, be intentional about like, okay, why that is. And I think that's important for research, but also in the client work we're doing as well. So we've been talking a lot about spirituality, and I really like how you both talked about the difference between religion and spirituality, and I was hoping that you could kind of tease that out a little bit more for us. I know that probably a lot of people listening are like, oh, well, like I don't go to church anymore, or I don't regularly do some kind of like religious practice. So like, can I be spiritual? What are your thoughts around that for both of you?
I should have known this question was coming. I did not.
I was thinking about that too, though.
Oh gosh. I think I'm going to pick up where Chye Hong left off a little bit, where for me personally, when I think about myself as a spiritual person, I think about the worldview and I think about the ritual. So, yeah, so in terms of my worldview, I think social justice is a big part, or like the way that I have, the way that I try to embody my Muslimness is around self-awareness and around self-reflection and critical thought, and then action in supporting marginalized communities. And so that, I think, drives my personal definition maybe of spirituality. But then I also think about how much ritual is a part of religion, and how for better or for worse, like that is for me what separates religion and spirituality in some ways, where there is some ritual and there is some like holidays or standards or symbolic events almost that are a part of your worldview or your story. And so I personally don't know what that looks like or how to tease that apart for me right now as someone who grew up as a Sunni Muslim, but really pulls inspiration from other I guess Muslim traditions and non-Muslim traditions. And so that's where I'm going to leave it, and then maybe I'll come back if I have a better answer later.
I think that's a great answer. I don't, there's not a right answer to any of this stuff, right? So I think your reflection is spot on.
I think, Alia, you also spoke to the complexity, right? In terms of the formal definition of spirituality versus religiosity versus our individual personal understanding of what it meant, or what it meant to be spiritual, what it meant to be religious for both, for us individually. Yeah, so I really appreciated the complexity that you're also speaking to, and even just seeing you in this space, thinking and reflecting and juggling with the complexity of it was very validating, because that definitely has been my experience too, where as we are just speaking, I'm just realizing how in the beginning I said that I am I consider myself a highly spiritual person, but not a religious person. And where it really stemmed from was that in spirituality, I see connection. For me, I define spirituality as connection between people, connection between energy, and that, for instance, so I have a quote system so whenever I open up my Google Chrome, I will see a quote of the day. And then for me, it's not just a quote, it's just also a reminder of this quote is here for me today for a reason. I may not know the reason why, but it's there for me, right? And so to me, that I define that as a form of spirituality, seeing a reason, connection with other people that's beyond what can readily be felt and perceived and seen by us. Whereas I don't consider myself as a religious person, and there was definitely this belief and this bias that I've internalized when I was along my childhood of seeing religiosity as something that is not entirely positive. And there's a lot of, when I think about religiosity, I think about organized religion, and then I think about the rules that's associated with different religions, and then how some of the rules can actually be erasing of other people's identities. Okay, and so when I think about religiosity, there's a stronger tinge of negativity that's associated with it, and I'm pretty sure that it has to do with the media and an exposure to media growing up too. And so for me, I'm also juggling in this right now in this moment of what does it mean for me personally to be spiritual versus religion, and why that is the case for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like what you said about self-awareness, Alia, and I think that Chye Hong, you really brought together when you talked about the connection, but then also like the awareness of like what is actually for me. And I've had this conversation with a lot of people about if people are competitive or not, like competitive nature towards others, like feeling like, oh, I didn't have this opportunity, but like, why did they have that opportunity? And it really makes me think of spirituality in a way of like really realizing that what you have is for you only, and you can share it with others, but like it came to you, versus it like may not be meant for someone else. And one of our Division 45 leaders, Joseph Gong, he said, that's stuck with me ever since January. But he said there's a time, there's a place, and there's a season. And I think that's the first time I heard it said that way. And I was just like, what a different level of self-awareness to be like, okay, like I applied for this grant or this fellowship or this opportunity and I didn't get it, but for whatever reason, it wasn't meant to be. That doesn't mean I can't be like upset about it, right? But not like getting stuck somewhere because you then miss other opportunities that are kind of coming your way. And I think you both did a really good job talking about how spirituality has helped you, in a sense, feel like this sense of freedom to like navigate the world in the best way you can. And I think you're right. Religion, especially driven by westernized social media and media in general, just has made a lot of people feel like certain religions are bad or they're oppressive in a lot of different ways. And I think spirituality has allowed a lot of people to navigate that world differently. And so I'm kind of wondering, do you both feel like spirituality is like a movement of younger generations to kind of claim back that freedom to practice in ways that best support their identities?
So I'm pulled to share part of my story as a way to answer this question. And I also just want to touch back on what both of y'all are saying around connectedness versus competitiveness. And I really like the connection that you made to that in terms of grad school, because I think in talking about spirituality and self-care, like that has been so liberating for me personally to know that like, I'm not here to compete with anyone except myself and my own journey and my own understanding of myself. And no one else will know how difficult or how challenging or how proud I am of certain accomplishments or of certain opportunities that come my way. But that doesn't mean I still can't share them, right? Or that still doesn't mean that I can't be in community when I have those celebratory moments or those challenging moments, because I do believe that we all are connected in that way or in some ways. In terms of if the spirituality piece is more of a younger, like a younger movement to be connect to identity, I will say, I mean, I think for me as a young person, like thinking more like middle school, high school, and I'm going to use religion intentionally here, was a way to create boundaries and a sense of control. And I think as I've gotten older, I have been able to deal with ambiguity in just a healthier way. And therapy honestly was, instrumental in that. And so now I think I personally am leaning more towards a spiritual way because it is so liberating. That is not to say that I think that young people are also still going to be pulled to some of the structure that I think religion in particular can provide when things are extremely chaotic and when things feel like the ambiguity is not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I am really struggling to answer this question. Like when Desa, you brought up this question, the first thought that came into mind was my dissertation data. I'm working on dissertation right now, so it's very fresh on my mind of how, so given my sample is very homogeneous from one university, and that 43% identify as a Christian, and then about 10 to 15% identify as atheist, 10 to 15 identify as agnostic, and then 10 to 15 identify as non-spiritual, non-religious. And then, but there are definitely others who identify as with other religious belief in there. And what struck me was not so much the breakdown, the percentages, but more so my advisor's comment, because she has been doing this work of research with this population over the years. And her comment was, it seems like there are less students on campus identifying as Christian compared to the other identification. And so in a way, I don't know I'm answering your question or not, but I'm just seeing her pointing out this trend. Yeah. It seems that it may be the case for some, but I really don't have enough knowledge or experience or personal experience to speak to it.
Yeah, I think it's a hard question to answer, and I think especially, I would say, based on research and things I've read, it does probably speak to what you're saying in your dissertation data, in that students may have just a different level of connection to their campus, and so maybe religion and spirituality may not be as forefront in their mind, and then maybe it's like that transition, like said Alia, between being in like middle school and high school and being like, I need this structure, and then being in university and being like, I need freedom, I want to find who I am, I want to be myself, without like the oversight. But then also I think grad school creates a lot of that itself, of just being like so close-knit in your department, or like so just one-on-one between everyone kind of going on the same journey as you in different ways. But then I wonder, like if we were to have this conversation in like 5 years from now, if we were still like, yes, like we're questioning life, or we're like, no, I've questioned enough life now, like it's time to do something different. Especially as you're both going through dissertation data, I'm sure there will be a moment where you're like, okay, I'm ready to bring the structure and the boundaries back, and maybe not to like have control over it, but just to be like, okay, life is a little bit more predictable, and like I don't have class, or I don't have dissertation defense, or just those other milestones that kind of, I think, has a calling for spirituality to really make us feel whole when everything around us is so uncertain. Yeah, so Alia, you brought up boundaries and control, and I thought that it was fitting because we're also going to talk about self-care today. And so as we kind of transition more, I know we've talked a lot about spirituality as self-help, but then also self-care. But then I'm also thinking, what are some other things you're both engaged in terms of self-care, and like ways that have supported you through your PhD studies or just life in general?
So just to clarify, in a way, the question is more focused on self-care, and then it may or may not be related to spirituality. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we really explored where you're both coming spiritually, and I think that has been really, really helpful. But I'm also wondering, are there other things that you're doing in terms of self-care that do include that, but maybe not at all? And then, like, how do you balance that? Like, I think I'm a year out from dissertation, and I'm like, how am I going to stay whole and like healthy and human like while going through that process?
Yeah.
I think the first thing that comes into mind for me, I love being outdoors. I love going on hikes. That's something that fortunately, unfortunately, I don't get to do often, all that much in Indiana, especially when or at least less than half of the year is winter. Well, it's relative. I come from Malaysia, right? So it's all year tropical, all year in 80s, 90s. Yeah. So, but I think for me, hiking has been a way to keep myself grounded when I have the opportunity to. In grad school, there are just so many times that I felt overwhelmed by so many different things. Not just the coursework part, but then it's also the emotional labor that we do for clients, the emotional labor we do for each other in the program. And it's also the identity development, right? Realizing in moments where, what did I just do? I just did a microaggression. What did I just do? I just contributed to the hurt of another person. And so coming into terms with those takes a lot of energy. And then a lot of times makes me questions. And so then I've set my entire life out to become a psychologist, to be helpful, to be supportive. And that's what I do. It calls upon the existential question of, am I fit to do this? And so when I am going on hiking trips, that's when I realize, it's big, it's huge, those existential moments. But then looking around at the surrounding, at the trees, at the lives that is around me, helps me realize that it is big, but it's not all that big, that it's all consuming. I think one of the very powerful moments that I had when I was hiking was I was so afraid of falling down, right? So I was looking on the floor all the time, and then just not wanting to be tripped by the branches and all of those. And then realizing in the moment, I'm missing out. I'm really missing out on the scenery that's around me, above me. And then making conscious effort then to look around. And then I draw a parallel with grad school of how we are so zoning in, focusing on one thing, and then not realizing that it is a part of a bigger picture. And so that was a grounding moment. And from then on, just reminding myself that the difficulties that I'm experiencing, the existential crisis that I'm experiencing, is a part of the longer, bigger journey. Yeah. But then I'm also recognizing that, hiking is what I like to do, but that's not an option nor an interest for different people. Perhaps even people who may not have the physical ability to go out and do, or the financial resources to go into a state park. Yeah. So I just want to also acknowledge that.
So I really also like nature, but you're making me realize like I've not been taking care of myself in that way. So anybody watching that, you may fuck up. Yeah. Self-care is hard. Sometimes you don't even know. I really appreciate what you said, and I think that metaphor around being like looking on the floor and not seeing the big picture is really, really beautiful. And again, I mean, I feel like a broken record, but I just feel like so much of my self-care really is rooted in spirituality and in community. And so when I think about like my own personal work around boundary setting and my own personal work around being able to say no and not feel guilty, or, you know, really investigating like some of the more ugly parts of my maybe family history or like sort of racial identity history and things like that, you know, doing that work for me is liberating and is very aligned with my idea of self-care, because I think like if I have the privilege of being able to do that work, that it's important that I do it, and I do it in a genuine and authentic and meaningful way, so that when I go back to my community, or when I, you know, make contact with someone who has similar experiences, that I'm able to speak to, you know, the depth of what that is like, and that I'm able to hold space in a deep enough way that they feel completely seen and heard in that experience. And so there's that piece of it where like I think my own self-care, my own therapy, my own like, you know, investigating of identity has been an odd sort of community care, because I know that like this is not just, I'm not doing this just for me. I'm doing this because it's important that I'm able to hold this space, and that I'm able to, you know, go back to community to transform, hopefully for the better. And in that way too, I think reconnecting with like the Muslim students on campus is important, or has been a part of my self-care, because I, again, shared like, I think earlier in my program, I was a little more hesitant around how much of my Muslimness to bring in, or how much of my spiritual self to bring in. And now that I'm in a place where I feel more comfortable with that, committing to that community and affirming myself with that community has been a big source of strength and a big source of support. And then, you know, because I'm older than some of the folks there, like checking them on some of their stuff has been, you know, a way that I feel like I'm using what I've learned over the past couple years to slowly make change and to slowly transform under this larger global, or like larger spiritual understanding that I have of my life, that I'm going to leave soon, and it's better if I leave it in a better place than when I came.
Yeah, I think what we both talk about here is connection in different ways.
Yeah.
And Alia, you really mentioned about the connection between people with communities, and that has been a form of self-care for you. Mm-hmm. And then earlier on, I talked about connection to the nature, and that's a different form of connection too. Mm-hmm. That I think also both spoke to how we define spirituality early on. So I think,
yeah, I really like how you make it exactly what you need it for yourself. And then I also appreciate like the kindness and the humbleness that comes off, even though it's very unapologetic in a lot of ways, because this is your process and what you're doing, and these are why things work for you guys best. And so I'm wondering, like, given your journey over time and just everything you've come to learn through your programs, or like just where you are now in this process, what is some advice that you would give yourself as a first-year doctoral student?
Oh, I'm ready for this.
Go for it.
I'm so ready for this.
Go for it.
Okay. First of all, Alia, perfectionism is real. Stop trying to deny it. It shows up in very odd ways. Just because people can label it, but you can't label it for yourself, does not mean that's not what's happening. It's also protective. So like you can affirm that part of you and challenge it. Yes, that is my number one thing that I wish I could say to my younger self. And I think I would maybe just give also like a message of hope, and that like you feel like you're drowning, but you've done this before. Like you've managed your life in all of its difficulty in so many other ways. Like, why do you think you can't do that again now? So maybe just like some affirmation, some like, you know, girl, this is perfectionism, get it together. But also some affirmation, you know, that like you're getting stuck because you want things to be good for your community and good for your people, but also like if you get stuck there, like nothing's gonna happen.
Yeah.
There's so much power in that.
Yeah.
Oh, what do I say to my first year self? I think perfectionism also kicks in. And I think one of the most powerful thing that I've heard people like the feedback that I've received from other people, my advisor specifically, is Chye Hong, your 100% sometimes can be 120% for other people. So you can do a little bit less and it's still okay. And I think that really spoke to, I guess if I were to say something to my first year self, is to still work hard, but you don't need to push yourself so hard. And that there's a lot of systemic barriers that you are experiencing that you don't even know and can't label it because you just don't have the language and knowledge. But you lived it, you experienced it, and that once you are able to put words into it, you will be able to better cope with it and externalize it rather than internalizing it. So the more that you like the learning process never ends, and learning is really hard, and that it will bring up so many parts of yourself that you don't even know you have. And be patient with yourself as you have conversation with these pieces of different people, the different people within yourself, but also different people around your life, and honoring the changes that you are experiencing as a person. Yeah, at this point I'm rambling.
No, I think that's so great. I think what really stands out to me is that I think we ended up talking a lot about boundaries and control without really like labeling it towards the end, but really realizing that perfectionism comes a lot from that, of like not having control and almost in so many ways trying to not just justify it to ourselves, but make it a little bit better. Like, this feels out of control. Grad school especially is out of control in a lot of different ways. But then like, how do we hold the space for ourselves, but then also like the kindness, the forgiveness, the gratitude that we're like still in it, right? I think students, even myself, end up questioning like, why did I do this to myself, rather than like, what a wonderful opportunity for growth, right? So even like, how do you change the language around that? And then especially like, I think it's important of pointing out the flaws and maybe starting there, but then like ending with like how great you did and like how great it is for you to be now. Like, I'm not quite at dissertation yet, but I think like, holy crap, like, it seems like yesterday that I was like, these classes are going to kill me. And now I'm like, this dissertation may kill me, right? So it's like, instead of just be like, oh, let me just take a moment to realize that I came this far.
Yeah.
Celebrate along like all the steps that's along the way. It's hard to do. Sometimes the celebration would just have to be toned down and just label sleeping in as a celebration.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But I think you were, there was something that you were saying. Okay, never mind, it's gone. I remember it. So sorry.
Yes, no, go. Right, jump in.
Yeah, it's that connection. It's also that we were talking about the self-care too. I think one of the very powerful piece of advice that I got from older students in our program is to find your people. And at the time, I don't know what it meant at all. And then it was so hard to find my people, and who is my people, like what type of people is nourishing in my relationship, right? And there's a process of finding that for myself and for here too. And I think whatever that look like for us, it to find the people, and for me it's finding the people that I can have deep connections with, one-on-one conversation that is very deep, that is meaningful, that challenges me to reflect on my perspective and how I developed the perspective that I had. Um, and also, it also helps so much with that sense of isolation in grad school. A lot of the struggles that we're experiencing it quietly. And when in these conversations, for instance, Alia and I have a lot of conversations, sometimes in random spots. But those are so meaningful and really help me reflect on the perspective that I've developed. And it also helps so much of kind of that finding my people and that connection. Yeah. So yeah.
Absolutely. So, what is some advice you would give someone looking to follow in a similar path as yours? So, given like your identity and where you're at, either in grad school or life in general, for students who are looking to get into PhD programs or like from similar identities as your own, like what is one thing that you would tell them to kind of get them started on their path towards like where you are right now?
I would say embrace might be a stronger word that I intended, but embrace uncertainty. There will be a lot of uncertainty going your way. And we talk about control, and there will be a lot of things that's not within your control. And being patient with yourself, with the people around you, with sometimes the system that you are in, as you are going into this uncertainties. It's like, if I were to use a metaphor, it will be like going into a cloudy day and then not knowing when the clouds might dissipate, when might the sun come back in, but reminding yourself that there are things that you can enjoy from this cloudiness, and remembering that the cloudiness will one time go away and then the sun will come back in, and in a very similar way the cloudiness will be back at some point in your life, and just riding along the journey and be open to it.
Yeah.
For me, I think I'm gonna speak to a little bit of what I've appreciated in my clients and why I think that's relevant here is that the clients who are very open to being examined and to making changes in their life, I think it sort of sticks, right? And I think about that for particularly being in a counseling psychology program where you're not just doing coursework, you're not just doing research. If you're a part of if you do community work, you're not just doing community work, you're also doing one-on-one clinical work, and the ways in which that can be very impactful and very transformative, but that you, at the end of the day, like, are going to be forced to do your own personal work. And if you're not ready for that, it's okay. Like,
yeah.
It's okay. There are lots of different ways to be and to make change. But particularly, I think in this field of counseling psych, the one thing that I've learned and that I would want to share is that, like, doing that personal work is a part of the work, and try not to separate it, or try not to be like, I'm just going to get in and get out with my degree, because, like, you know, that's really a disservice to our clients when we do it that way, I think, personally. The other thing that I would say is, you know, there are a lot of systemic things that are going to come up. And like Chye Hong said, you know, you may not even have language to identify like what's happening to you or what has happened or how to navigate that. And I don't want to say I don't want to normalize it, but I want to say that there are resources and there are people like us, like this webinar, like Division 45, and lots of other sort of avenues to understand and to navigate that, and to not feel like you're the only one going through something like that, even in the PhD process of applying, right? So the more people you're able to connect with, I think the better, because you'll get little tidbits of systemic knowledge that are very important to succeed. So
so just wanted to add and echo what you said, Alia, in terms of the resources. I think going into the program, going into this higher ed system, I didn't know that a lot of things that I can ask for, and people are willingly, openly providing information. Sometimes I would also fear impinging on other people's spaces by asking questions. And so now towards the end of my PhD program, I will say that is what I appreciated the most, in terms of people coming in and asking me questions about how to navigate things, and that it's not, in many ways, people are more open to answering and supporting you than you would imagine them to be. And that's not to say that it all falls on you to reach out for support, and that it is okay to expect people around you, especially people who are more senior or have more experience than you, to reach out to you and ask what you need. And it's a mutual process.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actually out of time. So today we talked about listening to stories. So listening to other people's stories, but our own stories, whether it's in research or the work that we're doing with clients. We talked about the good and difficult experiences we've had in our own clinical work, but even in when we've been in our own therapy sessions, or when we've worked with others, and how difficult it is that in a lot of ways people unintentionally erase identities even without even trying. But we talked about the difference between religion and spirituality for all of us, and how self-care really plays into that, in how in a lot of ways there's a lot of nuances and complexities overall. I really love that we talked about claiming your space. So what is your overall philosophy of life, in really connecting to identity, but also connecting to everyone who could be involved around you. But then also how self-awareness, intentionality, and connection really plays out what is for us, what isn't for us, but not being competitive, because we are in our own journey and on our own pathways. We talked about boundaries and self-control, but the overall journey that we're all on over time, from when we were first year doc students to where we are now. And we ended really talking about doing your own personal work, and how it really is a disservice to yourself not to do that work. But then also along the way, making sure you find your people, you ask for resources, and you're really open to asking for help. But most importantly, that you're open to receiving help as well. So all of that in a very brief synopsis. Any last final thoughts as we kind of close out the virtual mentorship program today?
Thank you for this opportunity.
A brilliant summary. Yeah, that was really lovely. Thank you for facilitating and for summarizing and taking notes in that way.
Of course, yeah. I very, very much appreciate y'all being here. I'm sorry, Chye, did you want to say something else?
Oh, I just wanted to say, similarly, thank you for bringing a full circle. It was a great summary.
That's what I'm here for, to bring us together and create some community. I just want to thank you both so much for taking time out of your Saturday. I know that you both are very, very busy. This was a wonderful experience, and I cannot thank you enough for being mentors along your journey to other students in Division 45. If you're listening today and you're interested in talking to Alia or Chye Hong, I please ask that you reach out to me, or you reach out to the Division 45 virtual mentor co-chairs. You can email us directly and we'll be more than happy to connect you. And I hope that you continue to listen. We are now on iTunes, which is insane, but we are enjoying the process, good and bad, for all of the things that it's worth. And again, I could not do this without the mentors. So thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day. And I really enjoyed meeting you.
Thank you.
I love talking with you. Thank you so much for having us.
Of course, of course, of course.